The figure known as the Antichrist stands as one of the most powerful and misunderstood symbols in Western religious imagination, not because it refers to a single, clearly defined being, but because it represents radically different ideas depending on who is speaking. Across centuries, cultures, and belief systems, the Antichrist has been feared as a tyrant, dismissed as a theological construct, reinterpreted as a political warning, and embraced by some as a symbol of liberation from imposed authority. To understand the Antichrist, one must understand that it is not one figure, but a mirror reflecting the anxieties, hopes, and power structures of the traditions that describe it. In Christianity, the Antichrist emerges from apocalyptic expectation. The term itself appears in the New Testament, particularly in the Johannine epistles, where it is used not as a single future monster, but as a concept describing anyone who denies Christ or replaces him. Over time, however, this idea evolved into a singular end-times figure. Influenced heavily by the Book of Revelation, later Christian theology shaped the Antichrist into a charismatic deceiver who appears as a false savior, performing signs, uniting nations, and ultimately opposing Christ directly. This figure is not merely evil for evil's sake. He represents the ultimate counterfeit, truth distorted just enough to mislead the faithful. The Antichrist, in Christian thought, embodies false authority, pride elevated above humility, and human power masquerading as divine will. The Christian Antichrist is often associated with political domination, economic control, and spiritual corruption. He is imagined as a ruler who demands allegiance, who replaces moral law with expedience, and who offers peace through coercion. This image reflects deep historical fears, the abuse of authority, the collapse of moral order, and the possibility that deception could be more seductive than open violence. Throughout history, Christians have repeatedly identified contemporary figures as the Antichrist: emperors, popes, kings, reformers, revolutionaries, revealing that the Antichrist functions less as a literal individual and more as a symbolic warning. It is the fear that power divorced from humility and compassion becomes destructive, even if it claims divine justification. In contrast, Judaism does not possess a direct equivalent to the Christian Antichrist. The concept simply does not exist in the Hebrew Bible. Jewish eschatology focuses instead on the idea of false messiahs, human figures who claim divine authority or redemption but fail to bring true peace or justice. Rather than a cosmic enemy of God, these figures are understood as misguided or deceptive humans. Jewish tradition emphasizes that the Messiah will be recognizable not by miracles or charisma, but by tangible outcomes: peace, justice, restoration, and ethical transformation of society. Anyone who claims messianic status without fulfilling these criteria is simply not the Messiah, not an apocalyptic villain. Because Judaism rejects the notion of Jesus as divine, the Christian framing of the Antichrist does not apply. From a Jewish perspective, the Christian Antichrist narrative is a theological development within Christianity itself, shaped by internal debates about authority, legitimacy, and salvation. Jewish texts tend to focus on human responsibility rather than cosmic warfare between divine opposites. Evil is not personified as a singular end-time tyrant, but understood as the result of moral failure, injustice, and misuse of power. Thus, where Christianity externalizes evil into a final adversary, Judaism internalizes it as a recurring human challenge that must be confronted ethically, generation after generation. The Satanist or esoteric view of the Antichrist diverges even more radically. In these traditions, the Antichrist is not an enemy to be feared, but a symbol to be reclaimed. Rather than representing chaos or destruction, the Antichrist becomes an archetype of opposition to imposed spiritual authority. In this view, Christ represents submission, obedience, self-denial, and reliance on external salvation, while Antichrist represents autonomy, self-determination, and the rejection of imposed moral absolutes. This interpretation does not necessarily worship a literal being. Instead, It reframes the symbol as psychological and philosophical. For Satanists, the Antichrist represents the individual who refuses to kneel before dogma. It is the human being who questions inherited beliefs, dismantles fear-based morality, and asserts personal sovereignty. The Antichrist is not anti-love or anti-ethics, but anti-coercion. It challenges systems that demand obedience without accountability. In this framework, the Antichrist becomes a liberator figure, not from morality itself, but from moral systems used to control rather than uplift. Some Luciferian and satanic covens also interpret the Antichrist as a feminine figure. This prophecy takes on a radically different form. Here, the Antichrist is not imagined as a male ruler at all, but as a feminine or androgynous figure. The emergence of a feminine Antichrist represents the collapse of patriarchal spiritual systems and the return of suppressed divine feminine power. In this view, the Antichrist is not a tyrant but a revelation, the reawakening of forces long condemned and enslaved by Abrahamic religions. Autonomy, intuition, erotic wisdom, embodied spirituality, and direct communion with the divine without intermediaries. In another esoteric interpretations, the Antichrist is understood as a force of balance. Where Christ symbolizes unity, surrender, and transcendence of the self, the Antichrist symbolizes individuation, embodiment, and the sacredness of the self. These are not viewed as opposites of good and evil, but as complementary forces. The tension between them represents humanity's struggle between collectivism and individuality, faith and reason, submission and autonomy. In this sense, the Antichrist is not a destroyer of the world, but a catalyst for transformation, breaking stagnant structures so new forms can emerge. Some esoteric systems interpret the Antichrist as the shadow of Christ, in psychological terms, the rejected aspects of spirituality that religion refuses to integrate. Power, ambition, sexuality, doubt, and self-interest are often suppressed in religious narratives, yet they persist in the human psyche. The Antichrist embodies these rejected elements, forcing confrontation. From this angle, the apocalypse is not a literal end of the world, but an inner reckoning, a collapse of false beliefs and inherited illusions. Within Christian prophecy itself, there exists a darker and more unsettling interpretation, one that has fueled centuries of speculation, conspiracy, and theological debate. According to this view, the Antichrist does not emerge as an obvious enemy of Christianity, but from within it. He is not an outsider attacking the faith, but an insider reshaping it. Certain prophetic interpretations of the Book of Revelation and the writings of early church critics suggest that the greatest deception would not come from open opposition, but from corrupted authority clothed in holiness. In these interpretations, the Antichrist would wear the language of Christ, invoke God, speak of peace, unity, and salvation, while subtly replacing spiritual truth with institutional power. This is where conspiracy and prophecy surrounding the Vatican arise, not as historical certainty, but as a recurring theme in apocalyptic imagination. For centuries, critics of centralized religious authority have argued that when spiritual power becomes political power, it risks transforming into the very thing it claims to oppose. In these prophetic narratives, the Antichrist is imagined not as a beast emerging from chaos, but as a leader rising through sacred institutions, protected by tradition, ritual, and unquestioned legitimacy. He would not deny Christ outright, he would redefine Christ. He would not abolish faith, he would monopolize it. According to this belief, the danger lies not in heresy but in absolute authority. The Antichrist would be recognized not by open blasphemy, but by the demand for unquestioned obedience, by the merging of spiritual leadership with global influence, by the claim to speak for God while standing above accountability. In this narrative, the Vatican becomes a symbol, not necessarily a villain, but a representation of how ancient spiritual movements can evolve into institutions whose power eclipses their original message. The prophecy suggests that when the institution becomes more important than the spirit, the conditions for the Antichrist are created. In this interpretation, the Antichrist reveals himself gradually, not through terror, but through comfort, stability, and promises of unity. He speaks the language of peace while centralizing control. He offers moral clarity while discouraging questioning. He presents himself as a shepherd while standing above the flock. This version of the Antichrist is terrifying precisely because he appears righteous. The deception is complete because it feels familiar, sanctioned, and safe. Whether one accepts these prophecies literally or symbolically, their persistence reveals a deep and enduring fear that truth can be corrupted from within, and that the greatest threat to spirituality is not disbelief, but unchallenged authority. Across Christianity, Judaism, and Satanist or esoteric thought, the Antichrist ultimately represents the misuse of power, whether spiritual, political, or psychological. And so the Antichrist remains less a single being and more a warning about surrendering conscience to hierarchy, a warning about mistaking institution for truth, a warning about obedience without reflection. In every tradition, the Antichrist asks the same question in different forms: who truly holds authority over the human soul? The answer, depending on belief, may lie in God, in ethical responsibility, or in individual sovereignty. But the symbol endures, because humanity continues to struggle with that question. Perhaps the most unsettling conclusion is this: the Antichrist does not arrive when faith disappears, but when faith becomes absolute power. And in that sense, the Antichrist is never merely an external enemy. He is the shadow that emerges wherever belief is no longer questioned, wherever authority is no longer accountable, and wherever fear replaces wisdom. The enduring power of the Antichrist myth lies in its adaptability. It evolves with cultural fears and philosophical needs. In times of political instability, it becomes a tyrant. In times of religious conflict, it becomes a heretic. In times of personal awakening, it becomes a liberator. The Antichrist persists because humanity continues to wrestle with authority, truth, and freedom. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification button